Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, wherever you are. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Jing Tsu today to talk about her book, Kingdom of Characters, The Language Revolution That Made China Modern. Now, this is a truly remarkable piece of history that showed us why China's most daunting challenge was a linguistic one, which is to make the formidable Chinese language accessible to a globalized and digital world. And it's not just the story of how Chinese language came to be understood, but also a story of China in the 20th century. Now, what I'll do in this conversation is that I'll hand over to Jing to walk us through this amazing story first. Then we'll also have a chat afterwards. And now, if you have any questions, please do send them my way by sticking your questions to the Q&A box or raise your digital hand in the Zoom, and I'll call upon you to answer questions yourself. Now, Jing, first of all, thank you for joining. And what does it take to reinvent the world's oldest living language?
Thank you, Vincent, first off, for the introduction. And of course, Asia Society in France. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with Vincent again, who I've known for quite a few years now. This book is very much about what happened to the written Chinese language in the age of the Western alphabet. And behind it is really this larger question, which people have been asking for about 80 years now, ever since Joseph Needham's masterful volume, 50-some volumes of Science and Civilization in China. Essentially a question of why didn't X happen in China first? Like, why didn't the scientific revolution happen in China first? So on and so forth. And so the Chinese language actually reflecting this question had always been seen as a kind of a deficit. And so, this book is very much about simply telling the story of what the challenges were, that it was not about deficit, but it was about kind of a technological upgrade. Because if you think of the Chinese language, the actually easiest way to understand how the written Chinese script is different is you look at an alphabetic word. It is a series of letters, and it is written out in a linear succession. And a Chinese character, when you look at it, it is more like, these individual characters which are composed of a cluster. It's basically a cluster of parts, and they don't roll out nicely in a linear fashion, but rather they kind of come together in different forms. They're stacked or, kind of like Lego blocks. So, this fundamental challenge in how it is physically perceived, which is why this book focuses on the writing system, the written form, rather than the spoken form, pose tremendous challenge if you think about how do you send Chinese in a telegram using Morse code, right, which is designed for alphabet letters and numbers. Or if you think about how to fit Chinese on a keyboard and a typewriter, how to get Chinese into the computer, how to even systematize it in a way that can be represented in Roman letters, and how do we take it apart once we get computer age, where you need to sort of break things down and you need to put them, reassemble them, through with the help of the computer and the digital infrastructure. So all these questions where each of them constitute a great bottleneck for China. So we don't normally think about it from the perspective of the Western alphabet. For China, every step of the way, they had to figure out how to level the playing field in order to take part in this infrastructure that's the global communications infrastructure that's essentially dominated by the Western alphabet.
Excellent. And you told various stories of these individuals who try to make Chinese language understood, not just, with the rest of the world, but also among its own people. China has a lot of people and with different dialects and different languages inside the country as well. These people range from Wang Zhao to Lu Xun to Lin Yutang. You told these stories so well. Who's your favorite looking back, after finishing this really amazing piece of history about this language revolution? Who's your favorite? And tell us about, their personality. What kind of stories, you told about them and why they are so significant in this whole process?
Well, that's a hard question. I have to say, for every human character that was chosen in this book, there's probably 5 or 7 others that I could just as well been devoting my time to, because these were all, these are not the great martyrs of history. When we take a class in modern Chinese history, we don't think of these people. We hear of the revolutionaries, the leaders. We hear of Chiang Kai-shek. We hear Mao Zedong. We hear Liang Qichao. These great revolutionaries who shed blood or led things into unrest and turmoil. But these are more what I call the second and third stringers of history. So not the first stringers, but kind of people like you and me. They're builders. They're the ones who have to figure out how to pick up the pieces after every revolution and to figure out how do we then now take the Chinese language to the next level, to the next step. How do we make it survive the 20th century which was full of wars and revolutions and foreign invasions and civil wars and more unrest. So it's pretty extraordinary. And I have to say my absolute favorite actually comes in around the middle of the book. And originally he was going to start the chapter, but after several going back and forth with my editor, we actually start with Lin Yitang first in that chapter, which is chapter 4. And this character is Bismarck Du, who's a librarian, probably the most eccentric, curmudgeonly, hard-nosed librarian you can think of, which is in some ways why I absolutely adored him, because he is someone who didn't even go to, Cornell or Harvard when he went abroad. He was in the Philippines, Manila, and he was the first, he majored in library science. And his idea was, he called himself Bismarck Du, because he was going to rule the field of library science with an iron fist. And so, of course, he's also someone who is almost inhumanly stubborn. And he was so devoted to books, he used to write these love odes, to the library. Very much we read it as cast in the form of the love, the lover, the beloved. And he would talk about the winks and nods and fights that they had. And in the end, it was an enduring partnership that lasted him a lifetime. And he was also, I liked him because of the innovators, right? He occurs in a chapter where there's this tremendous, very heated race to be the first who figure out how to, what they call the index to Chinese characters. That's to say, figure out how to break it down, use it as a way of looking up things the way you would the alphabet in a dictionary, right? I talked about earlier how the alphabet has this self-organizing capacity by virtue of B coming after A, S before T, so on and so forth. This immutable linear logic actually has become tremendously useful in organization. And organization is basically ordering knowledge, how we categorize, how we classify, how we perceive things in groups and chunks. And so Bismarck Du was very much partaking in this race of the character index race. And there were probably dozens of people. But I liked him because, he was not, he didn't toot his own horn all that much. He was not a self-aggrandizer the way the maverick that we all know of, Wang Yunwu, this other character, came up with a four-corner system, which if any of you try to use the Chinese library, in prior to, I guess, 2000s, you would know the bane and the woes of trying to use a four-corner system. And so Bismarck Du would look upon these people who were self-promoters, who were hacks, who were geniuses. He looked upon it with kind of a cool eye because he was always not, he was not smart enough to be a genius like Lin Yitang, who invented the Minghuai typewriter. And he was not such a hustler that he could have become someone like Wang Yunwu or any of his younger challengers. Bismarck Du believed in hard work. He was basically going to put his nose to the ground and just kind of, he spent about decades perfecting his own index, which essentially organized and analyzed Chinese characters according to the shapes that they came in. Just like what I talked about earlier, where Chinese character is clustered and sort of stacked in a different configuration. And he somehow came up with this idea of 8 shapes. And with those 8 shapes, that he continued to then build a card catalog, where you can look up any Chinese character and locate any book. So what I love about him was, he had foreseen that the world's only going to be a less and less peaceful place. What he worried about was, when East and West finally come together at a point where they can try to understand each other, truly understand each other, they're not going to be able to find the right books. So his idea was this universal library he would create will basically enable people to come together and to learn about each other. So I always liked that about him. And he was just such an extraordinary, funny character.
I also liked, you started this book with the story of Wang Zhao, right? He's also a complex figure, somewhat heroic figure, and laid the foundation for this whole revolutionary process. Tell us more about this man. Who is he, and what contribution he has made to this whole process?
Yes. So Wang Zhao was actually, he's my second favorite character. He's he was a Mandarin. I mean, he was basically Confucian on his time, which is why he started a chapter, bridged the fall of the last empire and the founding of the Chinese nation. So he's, I dub him very beginning. He's basically the fake Buddhist monk from Taiwan. And why was he camouflaged that way? Well, he had been in exile since the failed reform of 1898. Those of you who might know 100 years of reform that was attempted to basically save the empire, but it was quashed by Empress Dowager, and Liang Qichao, Kang Youwei fled to Japan. And Wang Zhao was actually part of that cohort, even though he had explained it was a much more complex relationship. So there was a bounty on his head. And he was either going to be killed if he stayed in China, or he could escape to Japan, which is what he did as well. And there for 2 years, he could actually just stay there and actually lived out his life in peace. But he stayed there and he was working on this Mandarin phonetic alphabet, which at the time was also inspired by what the Japanese did with the Chinese characters that they have been using for centuries, right? Japanese kind of used characters to create two different kinds of new phonetic alphabet. So it's much easier for them to sound out Western words using those two systems. Whereas Chinese, you couldn't really use it to sound Western words at the time. So he was coming up with this sort of 50 so symbols that was based on the kana syllabary. And he used, and this is very little known, the kind of phonology he used was not Japanese, it was not Chinese, but it was actually Manchu. Now, those of you who know that Manchu was actually the ruling elite, the rulers of the last Chinese dynasty, and they all learned Chinese because it was easier to govern a large populace by assimilating yourself into their language rather than making them convert, which for sure there would have been a lot of resistance. But however, the Manchu emperors always tried to keep their Manchu alive. So there's a lot of books written under the auspices of Kangxi Emperor in particular that was about basically preserving, he did a lot of dictionaries. Basically, the equivalent of Oxford English Dictionary was built under him. And the phonology of Manchu was also preserved through those very painstaking labor. So Wang Zhao's phonetic alphabet was importantly not Western, right, in its conception. It used Manchu phonology combined with Japanese. Now, what's really important was for the history of the Chinese script revolution was Wang Zhao was also the one who managed to put Beijing dialect forward as the foundation of what we now think of as Putonghua or modern Mandarin. Right. And this is through a series of maneuvers, political maneuvers, and almost fistfights, physical brawls at this conference that I talk about in chapter 1. So he was very much kind of a pivotal person in the sense that he set the tone for what was to come. And also, I just had great sympathy for this rather unsympathetic figure. His colleagues revered him, but they did not really like him. As with so many of my characters in the book, there's also something special, very special about him. And I just remember at the end of the chapter, I love that because he left behind a lot of poetry, which I looked through a lot. And he says something in a verse. He says something like, when I look back on my life, what do I regret? He said he regretted that he never listened to other people. And to that, he said he would carry that regret to the end, to his grave. But I think it's precisely that stubbornness and that unwillingness and that steadfastness in holding on to his absolute uncompromising vision that he was able to do what he did. And the same was true for all the other characters in the book. I mean, these are individuals who basically were going against the grain of their times. And they decided that despite the tide of history, which was sweeping them forward in all kinds of chaotic directions, they were going to hold on to something real. And I think there's a reason why these characters, these human characters, decide that Chinese language was it, right? For them, that was the backbone of Chinese culture, that regardless of what China is going to go through, Westernization, Japanese invasion, and whatnot, that the language must stay. And it's pretty extraordinary because, by all counts, if you ask any linguist, languages tend towards simplification. If you look at where Chinese was in relation to, Western alphabet at the turn of the 20th century, there was actually no real reason why it should have survived. It was hard to learn. It was cumbersome. It's easy to get it wrong. And not to mention there was a huge great wall for outsiders, like foreigners, as well as for insiders, right? The Chinese students, you and I will remember growing up, how much time we spent learning individual characters, right? Every night. I mean, and growing up in Taiwan, was literally, writing the same character 30, 40 times every time, every night to commit it to muscle memory. Whereas, the alphabet, you learn 26 letters and you're done. You can compose any word in any Latin, any Italian, French, German, what have you. And so it takes a tremendous amount of, I think, startup capital to learn the Chinese language.
And that is apparently also your own personal journey. You're learning the language, right? You moved to America from Taiwan at the age of 9 years old. And your father wanted you to be the Connie Chung type of figure, which I have to say, look, listening to your audiobook, you really do have this sort of, you have your inner, channeling your inner sense of Connie Chung, being a very, very good narrator, storyteller, which, I'd highly recommend our audience to download your audiobook in audible.co.uk or .com in America, and listen to the way you tell these stories. Now, tell us about your own experience, Jing, switching from Chinese language, traditional Chinese language, to getting very well-versed to English language, 26 alphabets. I mean, it did take you a bit of time. Tell us about this journey or struggle, or whatever.
It's interesting you asked me that because originally that part, I talked a little bit about this in the intro, and that actually was a very late decision to actually put my own personal story in there. Because I was in this kind of academic mode where you're not used to talking about yourself. But then a friend of mine, Elsa Walsh, read it and she says, I want to know how you learned it, because you're asking the reader to step into a very difficult world of Chinese language. If you weren't exposed to it, this is a pretty daunting task, no matter how well you write the story. So, and I thought that's such a good idea in some ways to also open myself up and to meet my readers halfway by telling them what it was like for me to grasp the English language. And it was a real change of a kind of mental universe, right? Like I remember that, thinking in Chinese and dreaming in Chinese is very different from thinking in English and dreaming in English. And that process took, especially in college, where this idea of critical thinking and logic, that's actually very much to do with the operations of grammar and English grammar. And with Chinese, it's very different. You and I know that when we read in Chinese, still to this day, when I read in Chinese, it's just a completely different feel. And to read poetry, I absolutely have to read in traditional characters even, right? Because simplified characters really is a relatively recent invention. And it's really funny that this even carries through in the recording of the audiobook, which thank you, by the way, for the kind word, because obviously I'm not a professional narrator. And at the time, my publisher had sent me 2 professional narrators, snippets of my book. And I listened to it and I was thinking, this all sounds great, but their articulation is wonderful, but these characters were so much more alive in my own head when I was writing the book. And so all of a sudden they seemed really flat. So I was telling my publisher, could they possibly, just add a little oomph into this part when they were talking about this character? And she just said, why don't you do it? So, there are all these, the audiobook, obviously, I carry a little accent in the way I speak. And so I was thinking, is that a good idea? Or I slur certain things, drop consonants sometimes. But luckily, they cut me a lot of slack. So it was, for a couple of weeks, just sitting in that booth, also listening to my own voice. It's really funny because a friend of mine said, Jing, imagine an audience in your head. Imagine an audience in your head that you're telling the story to. So I actually brought a photograph of my mother from when she was a teenager. It was taken in the 40s, and it was very much in those Hollywood days where every shot is about looking back, towards the back of your shoulder. It's a very wide-eyed upward glance. So it's almost like she was my captive audience for those 2 weeks. So even as I think about my mother tongue and along with my mother, as I'm talking about the Chinese language, but in English, those 2 ways. It was very extraordinary. It felt very, it felt as though the past self and present self just all of a sudden, they come together. And it was, so the linguistic worlds for me actually came together in those 2 worlds, in those 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, talking about learning Chinese, I'm slightly luckier than you are because I learned Chinese language in the simplified form rather than traditional form. But there is also transition in communicating with the whole nation of more than 1 billion people, right? Transitioning from traditional Chinese to simplified Chinese, and also transitioning from, say, Peking to Beijing. Tell us that this transition, what historical context did it take place, and how difficult it was in making the transition happen?
Yes, so you're pinpointing chapter 5, which is kind of a distinct break in the book, because prior to that we had these individual innovators. But chapter 5 with Mao is when the state took over this task or this mandate of modernizing the Chinese language. And it took teams of people, right? No longer real individuals, but teams of people, officials, the average person they actually solicited a lot of proposals from the population, a lot of feedback. But also, I think it's important to remember simplified characters, which you usually accredit Mao with, simplified romanization, did not start with him, right? Mao actually grew up. He was a teenager at the time when people were arguing and advocating for vernacularization around 1915, when Mao was a library assistant. So it was actually under the nationalists that simplification was already discussed as early as 1909. And the nationalists actually put forward a set of simplified characters, I think in the 30s or so. But the timing was not ripe. And there were a lot of resistance from within. People did not want to did not think it was blasphemous to try to alter the character writing. But, simplified character has not a very long history. Simplified form was actually abundant in popular usage. Street vendors used it. People around vegetable stands, when you have to sell a couple of cabbages, you don't have time to write out every character. So you just naturally simplified it. So a lot of us through habits of use. And a fact that's not terribly well known is that actually, a lot of simplified characters also come from more cultish usage. The Taiping rebellion, the Taipings were actually the ones who actually use a lot of simplified character in their official writing. And so, in fact, in our simplified writing now, we actually inherited many of those characters, and they were actually put into the original simplification schemes. And so that's chapter 5, where it took teams of people, this committee called the Pinyin Committee to do this. But the Pinyin Committee went through all that came before them, including missionary romanizations, right, that were left by Westerners who were here from the 15th century onward. They looked at all the different indigenous phonetic treatises, like the Manchu phonology. They looked at dictionaries, looked at earlier romanization proposals, like the National Romanization Scheme that Zhao Yuren and actually Li Yutang and others came up with. This huge row between, Latin New Script and National Romanization, because Latin New Script was communist. National Romanization was nationalist, and Latin New Script was communist, and they actually duked it out during the war against the Japanese. So, all this culminated in the 50s when China was unified for the very first time in the 20th century. Then they were in the position to basically put the force of national standardization behind it and take charge of how Chinese was represented in Roman letters. So, Peking, even though we all order Peking duck still in Chinese restaurants, it's not according to a sound or that's actually obvious to Chinese. And the one romanization system that was very prevalent, basically the most used before Pinyin, was Wade Giles, right, named after Thomas Wade and Herbert Giles, which Chinese had always complained that was very awkward to use. It was basically meant for foreigners, and its use of apostrophe and guttural stops, those are all very kind of unfamiliar and do not suit Chinese speaking habits. And so Pinyin was very much an answer to that. It was a way of unifying, of internationalizing, but also standardizing and taking back control of how the Chinese language was to be represented to the outside world. And I should also note that there's a very important footnote in there, which was the first romanization by Chinese was actually a Sino-Muslim, right? That was part of this different lineage that is, so I put this two stories of Mao's pinyin efforts and Yassir Shibazo's, his name, the Donghanis efforts into the same chapter.
We've got a question from the audience. Among the different mechanisms introduced by these great reformers, which one was the most critical in saving the Chinese language from dying? Actually, there is an interesting quote from 1907 from Li Shizhen, said, evolutionary theory says that the inferior should be gotten rid of. We must then start with the Chinese script. That was the start of the ambition, wasn't it?
Yes, and he was an anarchist, so you wouldn't be surprised that he said that.
Yeah.
Wow, the one that made the most difference. It depends on what purpose, but in terms of actually mechanizing Chinese that really anticipating the current digital age, I would have to say is Lin Yutang. His typewriting keyboard was actually based on a much more important reconceptualization that he came up with in the 19-teens, which is about how to break down Chinese into parts. Now, those of you who know Chinese know that every Chinese character, there's a part of character that recurs in other characters as well. And that's called a radical or classifier, whatever you like. And that's actually a way of that's always been a very important part of how to use, look up, and store Chinese characters. But what Lin Yutang did was, he came up with a very conceptual breakthrough was, what about not just looking at radical, but that every part of a character as a kind of modular part that you can use to recombine, to break it down. So that was a very important innovation, because what it led to was essentially how to think of the Chinese character in parts, like the alphabet, right? So once you break down a character into, on the average, a character breaks down to 2 to 4 parts. Then it actually, when you type into a computer, an average English word is close to 5 letters, which means that when you type a Chinese character, it only takes you between 2 to 4 strokes, which is much faster than trying to type Chinese out according to its Roman form. So I thought that was just when I look back, that was the most important breakthrough in the 20th century, was basically how to think of Chinese like the as if it were an alphabet, but without using any Western letters.
I also like the fact that, which you wrote in your book, I think it was in chapter 4, about how Lin Yutang carries the English dictionary all the time. He's a great connoisseur of English language, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. Well, he was Christian. Yeah. He grew up Christian, right? He grew up, his father is singing his father's church. Well, there was a Buddhist temple right across the street. They would compete. The temple and the church would compete. So he very much grew up in a kind of bicultural environment.
Yeah. I mean, even though your book is about how to make Chinese language modern, revolutionize the way we communicate in this language, there's also a coherent theme in it is also, China's relationship with the rest of the world, right? Typewriter has to do with a little bit to do with America. Tell us more about these stories of, how these Chinese reformers, even though they were trying to reform the way we understand the Chinese language, write Chinese language, but, they also have to deal with foreigners using their technology, and also how to combine them, create a synergy to help China modernize this language writing system.
Yes. One of the reasons I chose to write about this is also because there's such relevance for how we think about China now. Because if you look at the Chinese language, is really China's first attempt at digital revolution, right? And what it did, how it absorbed foreign technology while preserving its own. This is very much the consequence, right? It left a consequence that we're seeing now, which was for China, it was never about complete Western assimilation. It was about taking a necessary detour. But the idea was always that, very early on, 1912, it was decided the Chinese character was not going anywhere. They were not going to, despite these calls of Lu Xun and others, where Chinese script must be abolished. Actually, it was never really serious that it was not really thinkable that Chinese script would actually go to, to become extinct. The idea was always that you would use Western alphabet and harness the alphabetic infrastructure to augment, to fortify the Chinese writing system. And sure enough, because Chinese had to pull itself up, get through each of these bottlenecks. A couple of years ago, Baidu actually proved itself to be much more adept at machine translation, even went up Google. And it's really because Chinese had learned in some ways both the strengths and weaknesses of their own language with regard to the alphabet. And their strength actually came to also fortify certain parts of machine translation Western alphabet languages that were not actually focus of attention. So it kind of had to learn from both ends, right? It's kind of learned to think like the alphabet, but also learn from its own perspective how to, bring itself up to the level of the Western alphabet. So it's a very important, I think, pattern. If you look at even the institutional structure, the programs, the protocols, the project that surrounded how Chinese digital revolution happened, and basically starting in the 60s and 70s, building Chinese computer, how they interacted with foreign firms. This was actually in the last two chapters of the book, 6 and 7. It's very much we inherit that infrastructure, right? We inherited that legacy of it frustrated Western firms to no end that Chinese would agree to these contracts, but not really honor the terms. And the way they talk about it, you see it from both sides, how the Chinese were thinking about technological assimilation and how the Westerners were thinking about just breaking into a market. So it's really a kind of beginning of the clash that we see now.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that is also to do with China and the rest of the world was, early on in the book, you had this really interesting quote from John Quincy Adams, a former American president, observing the Opium War from afar and noted that the fight was over not chests of opium and unfair trade, but words and their meanings. When I read this line, I kept thinking about my own line of work as a journalist, trying to translate what's being said in Chinese in China to a language that is not my first language, but, trying to also carry the nuance and context so that the rest of the world could properly understand it. Do you find this sort of a challenge that journalists like myself facing today is also parallel to what the earlier days Chinese language reformers were pondering on?
Absolutely. And I would say that your task is even more important now, just because I actually agree with you, even writing this book's idea of like how to be essentially cultural translators, right? How do we explain not just what's said, but the context from which that is said, which is so much more important when we are so used to skimming off headlines these days. Yeah. And I mean, it's actually remarkable given that that's been 50 years, 60 years since, Nixon and the early contacts made Kissinger with China, how little we actually understand about China. How is that possible after, let's say, a couple's been dating for several decades and all of a sudden it's kind of like, oh, I didn't know you were like that. I didn't know that's what you meant when you said that we were going to be together. So I very much find ourselves kind of in an era of crisis in need of marriage counseling. And it's really bizarre how that could have happened. And I would have to say that China has been learning from the West, been an amazing understudy of what America and others have done. And they've learned it much more diligently than the other way around. I don't think Americans, Europeans have spent nearly as much time really understanding China. But China takes everything that's said here very seriously. And so I feel like there's a great asymmetry in how our cultural understanding has lagged. And I think it's absolutely vital for people like you or me, in the press room, me in the classroom. And I think also other boardroom, war room, they all really need this kind of cultural expertise now, because that is the fight we're in now, right? We're in this for the long haul. This is a neighbor, this is a bedfellow we'll have to be with for a long time. And we're at a loss because we don't have deep knowledge about them.
Yeah. Talking about study and translating cultural context, we've got the question from the audience. What are some of the biggest challenges of not only your most latest project, but of your career in this space? This isn't your first book, so you are what we call an expert. What was your inspiration to write this book specifically? I think you talk a little bit about the effort to help people understand each other, but coming back to these questions of, in this space, Chinese literature, Sinophone literature, what are the biggest challenges these days?
Yeah, I would have to say, if it weren't for how US-China relations have developed or deteriorated in the past, 10 years or longer or so, I probably would have still written another academic book. I really felt very much pushed and galvanized and really wanted to write something like this because, in academia is, we debate, we do hair splitting debates, and, there's some nuances that get us excited and oceans of ink can be spilled on it for decades. And I felt it was important actually to bring this to the public, that my audience actually had to be kind of outside because it was so much more vital. It was preaching to the choir, right? My colleagues in my field. It was so important for me to allow the outside person to understand, China in a way that's relatable, right? That it's not just make you think that this is some strange, inscrutable country, that culture that is way too difficult with complicated writing system and custom that we don't understand, but perfectly reasonable when you put yourself in their shoes, right? To anticipate, to understand the motivations, how they carry it out. Once you understand what is important to the Chinese, and I can think of nothing else, nothing more important for the longest time than the Chinese language, right? That they need to protect and are proud of and want to sustain at all costs. So I think very much it's kind of when I was at the Olympics, it was a crash course in essentially sort of thinking about the public.
You were the commentator at NBC's Olympics coverage.
That's right, at the Beijing Olympics. It was that itself is a remarkable experience that actually speaks to the question, the person who asked the question as well, because it just made me realize how important it was to, not sit, in the comfortable walls of an office in my university, but to really bring this knowledge to the outside. So they said, do you imagine what does the average, your grandmother washing dishes in Idaho know and would want to know about China? Like, how do you convey that to her? And I thought that was an amazing example because, very much what I was trying to do with this book is also, instead of making arguments, the academic, like, I argue that, or, like beat people over the head with, certain statements and arguments, simply to embed, to show the argument in the storytelling. And to tell you the truth, that was the most challenging part about this book, and the one that I actually came to really love, which is really, if you shed the armor of intellectualism and really just understand history as human-made, right? History shaped by choices and mistakes and individuals who find themselves in the limelight to do something, and they did. And the consequences of that. I thought that was just the kind of story, the way that I want to convey China to the world.
Yeah, I'm delighted to say that I was given a very similar piece of advice when I began to pop up on television, and people say, just think your audience is, someone sitting in the living room watching TV like your grandmother, and telling them, trying to walk them through this whole story. And so I think in this sense, you did very well. I mean, also, through telling these stories of these characters, right? We've got another question from the professional bridge builder from Germany. He's been in the space for the last decade, and he said, I'm quite worried the interest in the Chinese language is going down dramatically for a string of reasons we all know. How would you, Professor, advise the study of the Chinese language these days? It's not just a problem in Germany, really. I mean, in Britain, it's exactly the same. The number of subscribers to learning Chinese language is really going down. How would you advise it?
Well, so the pragmatic would be, I think there's a way of explaining that also because it's become easier. One could say it's precisely because it's easier than ever to access the Chinese language, right? You don't even really need to know it. You can look up in Google Translate. So I think I'm not sure about the dwindling of Chinese interest in this country because there's still a lot of students who are learning and taking Chinese. I think it's just become more dispersed. It is no longer Greek, right? It's no longer Arabic, the very hard language that nobody knows how to learn, but rather people pick it up. So it's not necessarily reflecting the statistics of language learning. And I have to say, China's worried about language too, but for a reason that's more common for any time we have a technological change. People worry about the old days being gone. And right now, actually just in April, the Chinese government came out with a set of regulations wanting to ban these bizarre fonts, these unorthodox fonts that have been proliferating on the internet. Because the idea is, fonts we think of here just, like a dozen or so others that we use. But in Chinese fonts is actually quite a thing in itself. It's actually, there's a whole design industry based on Chinese font design because there's so much you can do with this complex form, right? They can be so creative. But I think the fear is the government fears that, China are no longer learning Chinese the way they should, which is a kind of cumulative art, right? A kind of practice. But instead, they just like put in a few, moving their cursors around and fattening this stroke and thinning the other stroke. So there's a crackdown. There's a crackdown on the proliferation of Chinese in the digital form. So what do I think of written language? I think written language will remain with us, but I do think the cultural context of it is vastly changing, right?
Yeah.
Kind of just by virtue of, dictation. It's not even keyboard. I think we're going to bypass the keyboard pretty soon. And hence this whole quaint history. Voice recognition and God knows what, soon maybe just we think and it gets imprinted. We're already into the age of AI. We're thinking about predispositions, about unconscious, like thoughts that we don't even know we have, right? Being reflected back to us in terms of marketing, in terms of mirroring the taste that we didn't even know we have. And I think language will come to that brink as well. But in the meantime, what do I say about learning language? Make them practice at home. My parents, I'm sure your parents did too, Vincent, because all Chinese parents do. The greatest thing my parents did for us after we moved here to the United States, age 9, where I could have easily forgotten my mother tongue, was simply to have lots and lots of books around. I mean, my mother also taught us calligraphy. So, she very much made sure we knew our poetry, we knew our, essays, we knew our calligraphy, but just having books around, physical books that you can touch and feel, that you can live with. I think that would be vital.
Yeah, that's a very good piece of advice. Talking about the language characters, and also there's a dialect in China, right? A lot of people will ask the question, how did Putonghua become the dominant Mandarin in China? And there was a debate some years ago, whether it's Sichuanese dialect becoming the national language or it's Beijing dominated language. Yeah, tell us about this.
Well, there's a whole history of that, but it was settled, actually, in no small part due to Wang Zhao, or fake Buddhist monk in chapter 1, where there were actually, in terms of numbers, the southern delegates actually had the advantage. So it could have been a southern dialect, not Beijing, that should have been the candidate. But Wang Zhao did this maneuver where he held a separate meeting to vote, like some off-site location. It was very dramatic, and I documented it. I write about it in chapter 1. So, even to this day, you ask people in Hong Kong or Sichuan, if people know the situation, will tell you, we came very close, right? You could have been speaking the multiple tones of Cantonese rather than just the 4 tones of Mandarin. But alas, that is, one of the things I really learned about working on history of science technology with this book is how important is the first mover advantage, right? So there's a reason why there's certain historical moments where people force things through, because they knew it was basically be set forever. That you can't, we think of it very much, in this country, in the United States, where I think about the appointees in our Supreme Court. But it's very much those, so there are these rare historical moments where what you do could really change the course of history. And that's why I think all the characters in my book sort of very much saw themselves as being in that moment, even though they weren't meant to be heroes, but they kind of rose to the occasion.
Yeah, well, and thanks to you for documenting their stories and then give them new meaning in the modern day. We've got a question from another member of the audience. Can you go a bit more on your view about the importance of Chinese language in the formation of the Chinese philosophy and even moral system? You believe it has a bigger impact compared to other languages, right?
Well, I have to say that Chinese language itself, there are few languages where you'll see that has as much philosophical backing behind it, right? The origin of Chinese writing is very much that it actually partakes, it does not supersede the more primordial patterns, the order of the cosmos, that there are certain principles that are inviolable, certain patterns that recur. So one of the great philosophical origins, this myth of Cangjie, this famed four-eyed sage, who observed nature by looking up at the clouds and its formation and down on the sand and watch the tracks that are left by birds and even the shape of the stems of leaves, the veins and the structure. And that's actually what inspired him, that the origin of writing was basically a kind of human version of that, but it was not going to be opposed to the natural patterns, but simply be a part of it. This is a very different idea from Western alphabet, which prides itself kind of early abstraction, right? From the Phoenicians to the Greeks. Already with the Greeks, the alphabet was much more abstracted, which is what led to a lot of theorists, now Western theorists, who have been for decades throughout the 20th century, support the idea that the Western alphabet was the key to, in some ways, the supremacy of Western civilization, because it kind of, even learning for the Greeks and why they flourished in philosophy and mathematics, because they didn't have to spend that much time learning how to write characters like you and me. They actually was able to just move to sort of more abstract levels of thinking. And I think that is actually fundamentally misguided way of explaining civilization without recourse to history. It's sort of the historical context for both these languages to thrive and what happened. That's what made them what they are. So I would say that the philosophical baggage of Chinese characters I think is quite unusual. And early times, Chinese, the written word is equated with authority and power, right? So much so that if you're the emperor and you have a certain character in your name, no one else can use it, right? If the average citizen, the average Chinese person had the same character in the name, they're going to have to change it, right? Because there's a kind of very totemic. There's also something kind of totemic and talismanic about the Chinese character. So even that actually comes up in sort of more unorthodox history and traditions. So maybe I'll just leave it there. But that's a great question, because I think it's very much, in very few contexts where you will find writing with such pervasive cultural meaning.
Yeah. Do you have any observations, Jing, on the sort of a difference in terms of the language usage between mainland China, Hong Kong, Macau, Taiwan, because the characters they use are slightly different, quite different actually. And how does that sort of hamper or facilitate the communications of different parts of that region?
Well, that's a great question, because that was certainly a huge headache for Unicode, which is the subject chapter the last chapter, where you're basically streamlining how scripts are communicated. So, prior to something like Unicode, every language that you see, every script that you see that you use on the computer has to be converted into a code, right? So that you can, if I send something to you from Taiwan to Paris, it will come up unaltered and be perfectly translatable. And so that's actually quite a feat, because, Chinese was the ABCs of East Asia long before Western alphabet came along, East Asia, including Vietnam, because it was the character writing, it was the only mature, writing system in the region. So its neighbors borrowed from it. And so this long diffusion of the process, like Japanese uses kanji characters, but they evolve to have different forms and some even very different meanings, right? Korean, and then Vietnam also borrow from the compositional principles of Chinese characters, but to sound out their characters. So Chinese was used as an alphabet, like a phonetic alphabet. But the problem with all these, the same character having these different multiple lives in the different contexts, is that when it came to computer age with Unicode, where they're trying to code characters, it was a massive headache to figure out, okay, do we count these two characters as the same or different? Right? Because if they evolve to have different form and even different meanings, do they then do they need to be separately coded, or can they be subsumed under one? It's all like equivalent. It's almost similar to if you use emojis, now you have different skin colors. So it's very much the same, analogous to that. We have the same character, but it's like gone through these different cultural coloring and variations, but they still count as a happy face or a sad face, right? Or a high five. So these are the questions that gave rise to this small working group called the International Rapporteur Group, now the International Research Group, that I basically followed and chased down the final chapter to Hanoi to understand how this process works. And a lot of it did pose a huge difficulty for the digital age, because digital age is all about precision, right, and exactitude. And Chinese character writing is not about that. It is organic, evolutionary family tale of how one writing system became used by multiple civilizations and later nations.
Mm. Well, you condensed the entire process, entire history of the 20th century into this book of 300 pages. Tell us about the research. I mean, the book obviously took you to China, to Vietnam, and to other parts of the world. How long did it take you to write it? And what was the process? You told all these amazing stories. How did you find them?
Well, I think the chase began actually with my last book, where I actually it was an academic book. So it was called Sound and Script in Chinese Diaspora. And there was one chapter where I discovered Lin Yutang's typewriter. And so that led me down this rabbit hole. And since then, I would say, I've been to obviously several archives and libraries around the world, but most memorable is the Vatican Library in Rome, where I was looking through the first bilingual dictionaries, right? How Europeans were sounding out Chinese in French, Portuguese, and whatnot. And I remember sitting in the reading room, and I was laboring over these. I had a mountain high of dictionaries to go through, and there was actually a monk sitting, across from me, and he was reading this manuscript that was so old that the pages, it no longer closed. So they opened up like a fan in front of him, and he was kind of flipping through. It was in Latin. He was kind of flipping through it at a pace that I would through a magazine, like Vogue or The Economist. It was actually quite extraordinary. So every archive, I had this experience, and also, doing field interviews like in Hanoi, which I don't normally do as a humanist, or going to finding these old typewriters in different places, or in Singapore to study Baba Malay and to understand, how Chinese were outside of China, try to Romanize their own language and to try to preserve it at all costs, or, Hawaii, or, Copenhagen, to look at the original telegraphic code books. I mean, these were all sort of just the unexpected experience, and also the array of people that I came across. There's so above and beyond the characters in the book, there were so many more human characters I met, including the late John de Francis, right, who was these longtime advocates of Romanizing Chinese. And he wrote these books, like Chinese Language Fact and Fantasy, that everyone reads, when I was a student. And I remember seeing him in his home, visiting him in his home in Honolulu a couple of years before he passed away. At the end of it, he said, I have something to show you. And there was a curtain that separated his living room from a smaller study. He pulled it back, and there was a Chinese typewriter on this table. And he said he'd been trying to develop a Chinese typewriter like Lin Yutang's for decades. But Lin Yutang got there first. So, this Chinese script revolution is really very much alive. In fact, when I was sitting there in Hanoi in the middle of the semester, when I really should have been teaching, but I squeezed that trip in, I was like, who else would do this in the middle of the semester? And I was thinking, wow, I am part of the script revolution too. Like the many, many foot soldiers who end up being recruited, against your better wishes, or you're just drawn to this remarkable, saga of how to crack this Chinese code, how to solve this puzzle, and how to make it come to life.
Yeah. Amazing, fantastic story. We've got a question from the business friend. Any suggestions on using Chinese characters in your brand and marketing from the business perspective? Would it be embraced by Western consumers? For example, I want to use the word ma to describe the numbing sensation from Sichuan pepper, which is my favorite. But I am not sure if Western consumers will understand it. Jing, what is your advice? By the way, you probably need to take a commission from giving business advice.
I would. I actually am open to consulting on these matters, but certainly for ma, I will give you a free one. You would not want to translate as numb. I would say tingling, right? Tingly. Something more titillating as tingling. But there's certainly, you wouldn't be the first one, because we know the debacles. I think Louis Vuitton, a couple other fashion brands who tried to break into the Chinese language, advertising, and there was a couple of faux pas in the past several years. Yes, I certainly think there's a lot there that you can use with the Chinese language, but yes, but beware, and certainly consult an expert.
Excellent. I think we've got some questions from the Q&A box. Were some Chinese characters more difficult to reform than others? For what reasons?
Certainly that's true, because actually part of it's because once people start simplifying, sometimes they went overboard with it. And their characters became so simple, you actually can't really tell what they are. And so there was a lot of, dialing back. So there was a lot of kind of just, experimentation and with complex characters is actually not so hard. It's with this already simpler characters that you're supposed to simplify that actually cause a lot more consternation and frustration along the way.
Interesting. In our increasingly modern and digitized world, do you think that other languages will face extinction in the future, just like the Chinese dialect in the 19th century? What is your observation from linguistics perspective, Jing?
I can certainly tell you from a historical perspective, languages die all the time. And new languages also come into being. It's actually very much a kind of a remarkable example of speciation evolution. And we often mourn the death of a language, and sometimes the cause is political and willful rather than organic or natural. And so I think there's certainly different ways, but also languages evolve, they change. I mean, look at an old Hollywood film. I mean, who still speaks English like that? No one. Or if you look at, like a Chinese film in the 1930s, like my parents don't really speak like that. So, languages, sounds also drift over time. And how we command this range of sounds to convey or to communicate ourselves in is also very different. So I think, they are, when we think of extinction, we very much think of negative and we mourn the passing of things. But I think in some instances, languages evolve and they come into being and they die all the time. It's part of a natural process.
Sadly. We do have one last question from Andrew Maithman. I have to say, Andrew runs a very good newsletter called Slow Chinese. You probably recognize Jing. Yeah. How do non-Putonghua dialects fit with characters? For example, Asian poems, were they written to be spoken in a dialect that sounds very different to Putonghua? For example, I read somewhere that Li Bai spoke a southern dialect.
Yes, first of all, Andrew, I just want to say that I've only very recently started subscribing to your newsletter, and I love it. And it really, it gives me, it cracks me up sometimes. I really enjoy it. So, and as for your question, that's a great question. I mean, certainly we know that if you were to read Chinese poetry and you want to know what it sounded like, you'd be better off reading it in Cantonese, because there were less, the language is better preserved in the South, just because there's so much more invasion and fluctuation in the North. And so historically, over time, it's actually Southern dialects that are actually closer to what we hear in classical Chinese. In fact, the rhyme schemes, we read it in Mandarin, read a Li Bai poem, it doesn't actually come to life. But if you have a Cantonese speaker read it for you, you'll be able to actually hear the remnants of the rhyme scheme.
Excellent. Great piece of advice. And we should all go to learn Southern dialects now. Thank you very much, Jing. Thank you for joining us. And also thank you to our audience for dialing in. This is an extremely busy day. I was just joking earlier, everyone is now competing for attention with the British Prime Minister. So thank you for dialing in, spending an hour with us to listen to Jing talking about her really, really wonderful piece of history and research called The Kingdom of Characters, the language revolution that made China modern. And thank you to you all for engaging with Asia Society France. And thank you for continuing the conversation. And Jing can be reached at your email address, right? Yes. Jing, could you tell us how to get in touch with you
yes.
to our audience?
You can certainly write me, jing.tsu@yale.edu, or I'm also on Twitter and, I guess Instagram and Facebook. You can find me there. But thank you so much, Vincent. What a pleasure. Always fun to talk with you. And I thank Asia Society again for hosting this. And it's true indeed, on this very eventful day, I'm delighted and I'm grateful for all of you for joining us. So thank you very much.
Fantastic.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jing. Thank you, everyone.